I'd like to introduce our next speaker, and that's Dave Scott. Dave is a salmon biologist, and his work focuses on understanding juvenile salmon life histories to support restoration planning. Dave juggles two roles, his first as a PhD student at the University of British Columbia, where his research focuses on understanding juvenile Chinook estuary reliance. Dave's second role is as the Research and Restoration Coordinator with Raincoast Conservation Foundation, which is a team of conservationists and scientists empowered by science to advocacy to protect the lands, waters, and wildlife of coastal British Columbia. At Raincoast, Dave leads the Lower Fraser Salmon Program and Fraser Estuary Connectivity Project. Before joining Raincoast 10 years ago, Dave completed his master's degree with our morning speaker, Dr. John Moore. He studied the effects of flood infrastructure on salmon habitat in the Lower Fraser River. His time with Dr. Moore and his first exposure to working on the Fraser River and with Pacific salmon, and he hasn't turned back since. So Dave, we really appreciate you joining us this afternoon, and I turn the mic to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, thanks so much for the introduction. It's great to be part of this amazing set of speakers that we have here today. So as you mentioned, John was my master's supervisor 10 years ago, so it's always great to have him opening up, and he did a great job setting up for my presentation as well as the other presentations. So yeah, I'm just going to get right into it. I have a bit of a cold today, so you'll have to bear with me a little bit, but I should be okay. So and yeah, before we get going, I just wanted to acknowledge the organizations that we've been working with. As Laura mentioned, I have been working with the Raincoast Conservation Foundation for about 10 years. And Raincoast is really a science-based NGO with a focus on conducting our own research and then using that research to kind of inform and advocate for conservation actions. And so in the past, that was kind of as far as Raincoast typically took it. But ever since we started our work in the Fraser Estuary, we've now started to undertake some pretty large restoration projects as well. So I'm going to be talking about some of the research that we've been doing, and then I'm going to move on to the restoration projects that we've been working on. But before I go any further, I should acknowledge that I'm seated here in Vancouver on the unceded and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, as well as the traditional territory of the Tsawwassen First Nation, and that's where all of this work is conducted. And then, yeah, as Laura mentioned, I'm also a PhD student at UBC, and then I've also been doing a lot of work with Ducks Unlimited Canada and other partners to kind of fund and implement our restoration work in the estuary. And so, bringing us back up to Canada, to the Fraser River, like the Columbia, it's one of the greatest salmon producing rivers worldwide. But unfortunately, the lower part of the river runs right through kind of the most populated area in British Columbia, which is a highly developed area with a lot of agriculture and urbanization, which has led to the estuary being really disconnected by flood control structures and other structures over time. And so when you look at the photo of the watershed there, you can see it's this big watershed. It takes up about a quarter of British Columbia, and the numbers on there are just indicating different Chinook population areas in the river. So you can see there's a bunch of different Chinook populations throughout the Fraser River, but of course they all have to move down through the estuary as juveniles. And what we've found with our research in the Fraser in particular is that Chinook are really the most estuary reliant, spending a lot of time in the estuary, and that's been a big focus of my PhD work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And we've also worked with another PhD student named Leah Chalafor, who did a great study that looked at otoliths from Harrison Chinook, which are from the Lower Fraser River, and found that they were spending an average of 42 days in the estuary. And I'll get a little more into that. And then, of course, as in Washington, we've got some pretty significant conservation concerns for our Chinook salmon populations, as well as other populations in the Fraser River. And so we're talking about estuaries here today. And so when you zoom into the Lower Fraser River, it's a really highly developed area. It supports, the city of Vancouver and the rest of the Lower Mainland. And because of that, we've erected a lot of dikes and other structures, and most of the floodplain habitats that once existed have been lost. And I thought it was interesting when I was Also, speaking with some folks from Washington, they had a similar number of around 85% floodplain habitat loss. So we're in a similar situation, and you can see I've kind of circled these few remaining marsh habitats that are in the estuary. And we also have a number of structures in the estuary, multiple causeways and different jetties that were installed over time to control the flow of water and to really facilitate shipping traffic. And so, Raincoast being a science-based organization, we really wanted to go in and just start looking at juvenile salmon and their habitats in the Fraser Estuary. And surprisingly, despite its importance, there had been kind of a lack of research taking place in the estuary. And so we were fortunate to get some funding through the Pacific Salmon Foundation Sailor Sea Marine Survival Project back in 2016. And we basically haven't looked back ever since. And we've been conducting research in the estuary each year. And we're out there for a really long field season every year from March through August. And we conduct research in sandflat, eelgrass, and marsh habitats. And our focus is really just learning about where juvenile salmon are, looking at densities, looking at how big they are, how they're growing, and then getting into taking some fin clips for genetic stock ID to try to understand which populations these fish are coming from. And so we go out into various areas in the estuary using beach, purse seines, and fyke net methods. And that really depends on where we're doing our sampling. So you can see this is an indication of the different habitat types in the estuary. We have these fringing marsh habitats that I kind of highlighted before, and that's a lot of our sampling areas. We also sample out on the sand flats and then out in the eelgrass to the south there at Roberts Bank. And this is a figure just from our first 4 years of data, but what we found is consistently over time, we're really catching the vast majority of our juvenile salmon in those marsh habitats. And this is looking at Chinook and chum, which are the two most abundant species in the estuary. Chum being the most abundant really early in the season, but then they all tend to leave, and then Chinook are kind of consistently there later on. But when we look at juvenile pink salmon and juvenile sockeye, we also mostly catch those in those marsh habitats compared to those eelgrass or sandflat habitats. And so that's become a little bit more of our focus. And then, as I mentioned, back in our very first year of study in 2016, our colleague Leah Chalafor, she collected otoliths from juvenile Chinook in the estuary. And then she also used stock ID to look at the ones that were specifically coming from the Harrison River. And what we found was, that they were spending an average of 42 days in the estuary. So, a pretty considerable amount of time in the estuary. And we think about that. She also found they were growing at a rate of about 0.5 millimeter per day. So pretty good growth rate in a pretty extended period of time. So you can imagine that estuary rearing period is pretty important for these Chinook. And so when we look at the fork lengths of fish over the season, you can see those Harrison fish, they're basically arriving at the end of March into the estuary. They're staying there into May and then starting to leave in June. And then, interestingly, in the Fraser, we also have a population of sub-yearling migrant Chinook that are coming from the South Thompson River that are arriving much later, not really showing up until at least mid-May. And then we see some of them lingering around all the way into August. So you can see we have this really extended period of time that sub-yearling Chinook are using those marsh habitats in the estuary. And then when we look at the stream type fish, so the yearling migrants, we find that they're just kind of blasting through the marsh habitat in the May time period, typically kind of at the first part of May. And we don't see them rearing in the estuary as much. And then we also see some hatchery fish that are coming through not long after they're released, and they're also not spending too much time in the marsh. And as I mentioned, we do some sampling consistently out in the eelgrass, and that's been another place that we do find Chinook lingering later into the season, and that's where we also found those larger Chinook hanging out. So this image shows you a hatchery Chinook on the top and a wild Chinook on the bottom that were captured out in the eelgrass at Roberts Bank on the same day. And so just giving you an idea of kind of what those fish are doing when they're moving to the outer estuary and the kind of the difference in size between a hatchery fish and a wild fish. And so, and the blue dots there are the hatchery fish. So you can see they're a bit bigger. And we wanted to get into that a little bit more to see if there was competition happening in the eelgrass. So one of the benefits of all the work that we've been doing in the estuary is that the restoration work that I'm going to talk about in a little bit has actually allowed us to fund a lot of other research that we would have had to at least look harder for our funding for. So Paige has been looking at the diets of juvenile Chinook out in the eelgrass, and what she's found is those fish, they're moving from marsh habitats at those kind of sizes of around 50 to 59, 60 to 69 millimeters. Um, Out into the eelgrass, we see they first show up, their stomachs are still full of insects, indicating that they probably just arrived from the marsh. But then very quickly they switch over to eating those larger fish prey. And one of the things that's important when you look at this figure is it shows that it's really important for Chinook to grow really quickly in those marsh habitats, so that when they end up in the eelgrass, that they're able to then quickly switch over to piscivory and to eat those fish that are actually better prey items for them once they get out there. So really important that those fish are growing fast in the marsh, so that when they get out into the eelgrass, they can switch to that important prey item. And then another research project that we've been looking at more recently has been investigating sub-yearling sockeye migration in the Fraser Estuary. So that project has been led by Sam Rhodes, and she has found that contrary to kind of prior belief, there's quite a few different populations of sockeye that we're finding sub-yearling migrants down in the Fraser Estuary. So these little kind of 4, 5, 6 centimeter sockeye are actually, moving down into the estuary from a variety of populations that are considered to be more of like lake type rearing populations. So we're going to be following up on that research as well, to just try to broaden out our understanding and kind of get away from focusing only on Chinook, although I know a lot of us like to focus on Chinook. And so back to the Fraser Estuary and to our restoration works. So the Fraser Estuary is a really highly modified area, and it has these really extensive sand and mud flats that stick out for about 5 kilometers kind of from the marsh before you really reach any deeper water and reach that kind of full ocean area. And so historically, that whole area would have been really shallow, and it wasn't very convenient for shipping activities. And so back in the early 1900s, they created these two main jetties, so the North Arm Jetty and the Steveston Jetty, and they actually dug the channel and kind of side cast material and built these jetties as they went, so that they could make these shipping channels. But obviously that's a bit of a problem for juvenile salmon that are trying to stay in the estuary and use those important marsh habitats. So this picture kind of shows you've got the jetty in the middle, you've got the river on one side, you have marsh on the other side, but there isn't really any access points. And so starting back in 2017, Raincoast began to look at creating some openings in this Steveston jetty structure. And just to give you an idea, the jetty is 8 kilometers long. So it's this really long structure. There's a couple openings in the second half, but they hadn't created any openings at all in the first half. And so kind of by the time fish were getting out into that second half, they're basically out in the ocean. So we got some funding from DFO, and we went and we created 3 50-meter breaches in the Steveston jetty. And so when you look at the 3 different breaches, you can see that the idea was that we just created kind of a small opening in the actual jetty structure, and then we're allowing the flow of water over time to actually create those channels. So at the West Breach, we've had this really amazing channel that's already been created, whereas at the other two breaches, the channel creation is coming along a bit more slowly, but it has been kind of evolving from year to year over time. And so that approach, made it a lot easier than trying to go out onto that big sand flat area and dig out a big channel. So we really just removed that material from the jetty itself. And we then moved on to the North Arm Jetty. And so the North Arm Jetty is about a 6 kilometer structure, and it has essentially the same impact. So pushing salmon out around the jetty and not allowing them to stay in those marsh areas. So we created two 30-meter breaches in the Steveston North Jetty, and we tried to put them, closer to the start of the jetty as well, because we figure that the more effective the breaches are going to be, the closer they are to kind of the base of the structure. And so when you zoom in, you can see what those two breaches look like. We have a ton of rock work just to make sure that those breaches are going to be stable over time. And what we actually did with all the material, I know somebody had a question about that for other projects, is we actually just placed the material kind of in between the two breaches. So we kind of built up the area that's in between the two breaches, which allowed us to, have a kind of a more reasonable project where we could actually move a ton of material and not have to take it off site. Whereas for the Steveston jetty breaches, we actually had to take the material off site, and we disposed of some of it at the disposal at sea site. And so you can imagine that these jetties are, they're there for a reason, right? And they're there to facilitate shipping in the estuary. So in order to actually be able to move ahead with these projects, we had to convince Transport Canada and the Port of Vancouver and others that we weren't going to actually have any impact on the shipping work that happens in those main channels. So the main part of that is really the hydraulic modeling work that we did, looking at potential cross currents and potential sedimentation into the main channel. We looked at different orientations for the breaches, and then we came up with our engineering plans. And so, along with that, we also had to work with Transport Canada on what was going to be our longer term maintenance plan. So, monitoring plan in terms of impacts to the shipping channel. And so that's really been looking at cross currents, doing these surveys with these drogues. And then we do annual LiDAR surveys of the breach and surrounding area at low tides. And then we do annual sounding surveys in the main shipping channel to ensure that we're not causing sedimentation into the main channel. And then the fun part, we go out and we try to catch fish moving through our breaches. So you can see at the Steveston Jetty in 2019, the breaches were really small to begin with. The opening is just at the rock structure, and there hadn't been much of a channel that had been carved out into the marsh yet. But over time, that really changed and made our sampling very different over time. And by 2021, 2022, especially at the West Breach, we had this, you can see that's our 17-foot boat for reference. So we have this big, wide open breach channel that's pretty hard to sample, but we go out there and try to just get an idea of what fish are moving through. And then, of course, we do the same thing with our North Arm breach. And so, again, our North Arm breach is pretty large. We're not able to string our net across the entire channel, but we go out there and we do like short 10-minute sets just to get an idea of what fish are moving through our breaches. And so what we found is basically that our target species are what we're seeing moving through those breaches the most often. So the majority of fish that we capture in high densities are these small Chinook salmon fry from the lower Fraser River, starting off at only 40 to 50 centimeters. So we imagine that those are the Chinook that really want to be retained in the marsh part of the estuary. They don't want to be pushed out too early by these jetty structures. So we're really happy that those were kind of the majority of the Chinook that we were seeing at our sites. But we also do see some of those stream type fish, some hatchery fish, as well as these stream type fish from the upper Fraser, and then a small number of hatchery fish as well. And then we also have those South Thompson ocean type fish coming through a little bit later. And so when you look at the map on the side of the screen, it gives you an idea of where all of these fish are coming from. So, we have stream type fish that are coming from way up in the upper Fraser, as well as our lower Fraser fish, our South Thompson fish, all of which we're capturing moving through our jetty breaches. So giving you an idea of the potential benefit of doing restoration in an area like the Fraser River Estuary, where you have multiple populations that are, they're coming right to you. So if you can provide a benefit for them in that location, you don't have to go to them, which is pretty neat to see. And so key project takeaways from that, the creation of the breaches has significantly improved connectivity for juvenile salmon, including Chinook salmon fry. At our Steveston jetty breaches, kind of the highest passage rates we saw were around 30 Chinook per hour, but at our North Arm breaches, we had really high rates of like up to 600 Chinook per hour moving through the breach. We've been able to satisfy the port and Transport Canada that these breaches have had no impact on navigation in the adjacent shipping channels, which has been great, because potentially they would have made us go back and fill them in or something that we really didn't want to do. And channel development has occurred, but with very variable rates over time. So, the spring freshet has also varied quite a bit in the Fraser. So, depending on the strength of the freshet, kind of the channel development also varies from year to year, but it's continuing. And so moving forward, we're really happy with the connectivity restoration work that we've undertaken. And so then we really wanted to start addressing habitat gaps in the lower Fraser. And interestingly, we're also taking Greg Hood's stepping stone approach. So thanks for also introducing that concept already for me. And so this is a figure just kind of looking at areas of habitat and then areas that are kind of lacking habitat in the lower Fraser. So taking that same patch approach, although we shorten the distance here to, I think, only a kilometer distance between patches. And so we're really now looking at moving into the river and working more on marsh restoration. So we're currently looking at 5 different sites, all in the North Arm. It's pretty difficult to find sites in the Lower Fraser River. There's a ton of development. All the land is super expensive, so it's pretty tricky. But we have found some areas in the North Arm for now. Pretty difficult in the South Arm, but we're looking for more areas. And the other thing that we're looking at is how we can reduce threats to the marsh habitats that already exist. So a few of the things that have been already mentioned today. So geese overgrazing is a huge problem in the Fraser Estuary as well. This image here shows a marsh compensation site that's completely overgrazed by geese. We also have a ton of shipping traffic, so we do have a lot of issues with wake. We have issues with log booming, not only the booms themselves kind of smothering marsh, but a lot of loose cut logs that escape from the log booms and then end up in various places in the estuary. So, doing marsh restoration in the Lower Fraser is partially about finding sites where you can create marsh, but also about trying to worry about those threats. And so this past February, we actually conducted our first ever large marsh restoration project. This was at a site that was a previous compensation site, which had really limited connectivity and which had been completely dominated by invasive cattail. And so this is a site we've been looking at for a little while. You can see with these images, there's this wooden screen that was placed across what was supposed to be the outlet channel, and there's a bunch of riprap blocking the outlet channel that basically dog walkers, as you can see in the photo, moved and basically blocked the outlet channel. And so we decided that this was a pretty low-hanging fruit site that we could go in and do some restoration at. And so the first thing we did in the fall was we went and we cut the cattail at the site. We have another site where we did the same thing, and you can get an idea of what the cattail was like by looking at our staff there with it towering over them. But then we went back and we tried to make it so that it wasn't going to be a good site for cattail. So we went back, we removed that wooden screen, we added an additional outlet on another part of the basin, and we excavated the whole basin to really bring it down by about a meter so that it would be a lot better habitat for sedges and other native marsh plants, and not so ideal for those invasive cattails. And so that just occurred just in January and February of 2025. And yes, that was our first project like this, but we have a couple more that we're planning for the next couple of years. And then we went out and we planted the marsh with over 10,000 plugs. We have carex plugs, but also a variety of other plants, trying to plant some wapato and get more of a mix, as these past compensation sites, they were really focused only on planting Lingby sedge because they were really focused on kind of a productivity approach. So we're trying to, plant a little bit more of a diversity of habitats in there. And so we just did this planting at the end of March, but right now it's looking better and better every day, and we've been really happy with that. So we're going to continue to do some supplemental planting at the site, and as well as some cattail management. And then we went out there and we started catching fish at our new outlet channel. And so one thing that's a bit unique with this area is as I mentioned, dog walkers had built kind of a little rock structure across the previous mouth. So you can kind of see in this photo, we've actually also put in these blocks that kind of allow people to kind of skip across our channel with the idea that they wouldn't block it again. But so we've been going out and doing monitoring in our channel and comparing it to what we saw last year. We've seen a 25-fold increase in juvenile salmon using that marsh basin. So we've seen a huge increase in juvenile salmon use where basically, the cattail had kind of taken over the whole marsh. There wasn't really a channel left. Now we've really opened it up and we're already seeing lots of juvenile Chinook and chum and other species using the site just a few months after restoration, which is great to see. And so moving forward, as I said, we have 4 other projects that we're looking at over just the next few years that are, getting pretty close to shovel ready. So that's good. We have some funding from DFO. Hopefully that will continue. And yeah, we're hoping to work with First Nations and other levels of government to conduct these projects while also addressing some of those threats that I mentioned that are impacting our marshes because it doesn't do us any good to go out and do a big marsh restoration project if the geese are just going to eat it all. And so, yeah, thank you so much for having me and for listening. I love this photo. It's a beaver that actually was way out at our west reach. So if you're wondering how far beavers go out into the estuary, apparently it's pretty far. And I also had a link on there. If you go to Ducks Unlimited Canada's YouTube, there's also a video that we just posted about our project at Woods Island. So it's about a 6-minute video and we just posted it a few days ago. So feel free to check that out. And yeah, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. That was a fantastic presentation that wove so many nice pieces from this morning's talks into the afternoon. So I appreciate that. And it was really interesting how you started with a demonstration of the importance and the value of the estuary, especially to Chinook, and the reliance on marsh habitat, and how you led us through the sort of progression or evolution of restoration focus for Raincoast and targeting marsh habitat as these stepping stones up the river. So yeah, really inspiring and yeah, great work. I'm going to look at some Slido questions. We've got one that clearly stands out above the rest with a number of votes. And that's sort of that forward vision. You've mentioned you've already got some near shovel-ready projects for the estuary, but looking, I guess, broader or maybe kind of bigger picture, do you have anything else you see as restoration work that you'd love to make happen on the Fraser Estuary?
Yeah, I think, one of the most important things is that kind of off-channel habitat that used to exist on the Fraser that has really been lost. A lot of the compensation work kind of focuses on marshes that are just kind of along the margins of the river, but especially in the South Arm, I think, trying to create areas that juvenile salmon can duck out of the flow and actually go into some side channel areas. A lot of the islands that used to exist in the Fraser have been kind of amalgamated with the shore, and all those areas of those little sloughs and things have really been cut off. So it really seems like there's, especially in the South Arm, fish are moving really quickly and don't have a lot of chances to kind of move away from the river. So I think it's really important to try to provide some more access to off-channel habitat in the lower Fraser.
Yes, continuing with that then, and I know the Lower Fraser fairly well myself, what are some of the, I guess, figurative barriers that are in place that prevent, making some of that off-channel habitat more accessible? I know there's physical barriers in some places, but what do you see as some of the obstacles to trying to access that in such a heavily utilized and subscribed estuary?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, because the whole area is just so low lying, and the flood risk is so high in so many areas that we have all these flood control structures that really cut off a lot of that potential habitat. So even in areas where, the side channel slough still exists, typically there's going to be some kind of floodgate or other structure that's there. And unfortunately, with sea level rise and climate change, there's kind of more impetus to build more of those flood control structures. So I think, trying to figure out how we can balance those needs between flood control and habitat is really important because it's really tough. A lot of the properties have already kind of encroached on the river, and there's a lot of metal seawalls and things, and there's not a lot of room to back off. So it's pretty challenging just with the environment that we're already stuck with. But finding any areas where the land isn't being utilized or maybe doesn't have so high of a value is also a way of trying to get around those barriers. But yeah, it's very challenging with all the land use and the flood issues in the Fraser.
Well, you've given me the perfect opportunity to make a little plug for a workshop that we'll be doing, a half-day workshop in September on tide gates. And so I appreciate you giving me that plug. When we were planning this workshop, Greer and I recognized that thinking about estuaries, you really need to have the conversation about tide gates at the same time, but we felt like it was just no way we could fit it into a single day. And so hence why we've kind of created this mini workshop that will really focus in on that topic. So I appreciate you giving me the chance to plug that. I'll pull another question here on the Slido, and it's been sort of bouncing around a little bit, and it's from somebody who must know the Fraser well. They said that we know you've looked at breaches on other causeways and jetties. What are some of the logistical challenges with a site like McDonald Slough out near the airport or Deltaport? Have you had thoughts around how to overcome some of the challenges for doing breaches at other locations such as those?
Yeah, I mean, both of those are, the problem with both of those is that you have a lot of trucks and, in the Deltaport Causeway of trains going over top of it. So it's not as simple as our jetty breaches, which were just kind of, further out in the estuary. McDonald's Slough is something that we've looked at for quite a while that unfortunately is just kind of stuck with the whole Iona wastewater treatment facility upgrade happening right now. Metro had been looking at it. It was a little bit above the kind of costs that we could support. So just looking at building about a 16-meter bridge was going to be around $4 to $5 million. So it was beyond kind of the scope of the funding that we had. And so that's why we did the North Arm breaches as opposed to the McDonald Slough. And then, with the Deltaport Causeway, there's been a huge push around RBT2 to create breaches in the Deltaport Causeway, but that's taking the level of cost up, another order of magnitude. And so those are, for the most part, it really just comes down to kind of a lack of willingness of regulators, kind of like a hesitancy, around people in the shipping industry, but mostly just a huge cost, unfortunately.
Yeah, I could imagine when you hear about the budget for Lower Columbia Estuary that Catherine was alluding to, you got to dream of all that we could do up
jealous,
here.
yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned about geese a couple of times of this recognizing the value of marsh habitat for salmon and the dream to create these stepping stones of marsh habitat to facilitate that out migration for salmon, and geese are very problematic to trying to achieve that. So could you talk a little bit about exclusion methods that you've tried or seen some success with?
Yeah, so for our project so far, we haven't had any geese exclosures, but we have been working a lot with Ducks Unlimited, Tara Martin's lab at UBC, and others on Vancouver Island who have done a lot of work around geese exclosures. So, on the island, it seems like they have had a lot of success using more natural types of exclosures. So that's what we would be looking at. We don't love the idea of putting snow fence into the estuary and potentially getting just kind of washed away into the ocean, which it seems like occurs at some sites. But trying to use that ecocultural fencing approach that the folks from Guardians of Our Salish Estuaries on Vancouver Island have been pioneering. So in the future, when we're looking at some other marsh projects, that's probably what we'll look to, as well as encouraging potential for goose harvest as well to reduce the population.
Great, appreciate that. We'll just wrap up with one question, if you can kind of craft a short-ish answer to it. And it was just in regards to the breaches and what potential impact there might have been on the shipping. I know that was monitored very carefully because that was a concern with making those breaches. And if, you could comment if there was any effects on shipping.
Yeah, I mean, so we kind of ended up with the happy medium of making the breaches only 30 to 50 meters wide. And these are structures that are, kilometers long. So that was kind of what we modeled, where we figured we wouldn't really have any impacts. And when we look at it, the kind of cross current impacts are really minimal, especially compared to the size of the ships that are moving by. And then when you look at our north arm breaches, there's actually just log booms that are all along the side of the river, so they kind of negate any real cross currents. And we've been pretty fortunate. The way that we kind of designed the breaches and the way we figured they would work was that the movement of water would really be from the river out onto the sand flats, so there wouldn't be a ton of material moving in. So yeah, we were pretty confident from our modeling, and it's pretty much gone how we expected. So it's been really good. Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you, Dave, so much for the presentation. And there's one question that floated around the Slido. We don't have time to get to it, but it's in just regards to the use of sediment out in the out in the marsh habitat. And I'll direct folks to a talk that we did just over a year ago that we had. It was Eric Bulk, who's a close colleague of Dave's, who works with Ducks Unlimited, and Eric did a really outstanding presentation for us on some innovative restoration that's happening out on Sturgeon Bank with the reuse of dredge material. So I encourage you to go back into the library and take a look at Eric's talk from last year as a sort of an added chapter to what Dave's presenting today. And I'm now turning the mic over to Jason to introduce our last speaker of the day.